Welcome to Beneath Your Beautiful, where guests share stories of adversity and perseverance, which inspire, encourage, and challenge us. We embrace these tough conversations, intimately exploring our loves, fears, and hopes with a delicious combination of depth and lightness.
I'm Anita Morris. I am an online sewing instructor. I absolutely love sewing, and I really enjoy teaching other women how to sew their own garments. I am a transformational speaker, and I'm an author, and my book is called Step Into It, Overcoming Trials That Lead to Purpose.
I saw you at a conference. You were a speaker at Forever Fierce, and you spoke about your husband had just passed away, I believe. Have you written your book because of that incident or experience?
Well, yes, that was my plan. That was my purpose for writing the book. However, when I started writing, I started writing the book in 2020. Mm-hmm. So as you can imagine, I had to go through a very deep grieving period and healing time. So in 2020, when I was prompted to write the book, my purpose was to share about the experience and what my husband went through in his death and how I walked through a healing process. Now, what I didn't share when I introduced myself is that I am a woman of God. I believe in Jesus Christ. He is my foundation, my anchor, my source of life. And I was prompted by God while I was writing this book to share the other parts of my story. And I didn't want to share because it was dark and devastating. There were periods in my life that were dark and devastating that I didn't want people to know about. But I had to share it because I knew that it was a call from God. And even though I was fighting him about it, I eventually surrendered and said, okay, God, if you want me to share this, then there must be a reason. There must be a purpose behind it because he's very intentional. And I said, okay, I'm going to share this. So I'm going to go back to my becoming a sewing instructor. So I learned to sew when I was in my early 20s, and I just jumped into it. I absolutely loved it, and it just took off. So the way my sewing brand started was from the dark, devastating time that I didn't want to share. So I found myself one day in my bedroom closet, down on my knees crying. And it was after I discovered that my husband was having an affair. And Hara, that was the most devastating thing for me.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, I know you've been married. So it was very devastating. And I didn't understand because my husband and I, we had a nice marriage, aside from the typical ups and downs that you experience in marriage, because there is no perfect marriage. We had a good thing. And so I was kind of confused, and he treated me really well. Like, my husband treated me like a queen. I always say he treated me like a queen. So I was confused. And then, of course, all of the questions started rushing into my mind. And I wanted to know things like, who is the woman? Where did he meet her? How long have they been seeing each other? I wanted to know if my husband was in love with another woman. And Hara, I wanted to know where they were, because when I found out he was with her. And yeah.
How did you find out?
My husband and I would go to the gym together. So he worked 24-hour shifts. And when he got off from work, he would come to the gym and I would be there. Or if he was off, we would go to the gym together. Well, on this particular day, he had worked. And so he showed up at the gym, and we wouldn't work out together, but we would be there at the same time and do our routines. And usually I would leave first to go home, because I think usually he would get there after me. So I would be done with my workout and I would go home, and then he would finish up his workout. And then he would usually go to the grocery store, because he was the cook in our family, to get the ingredients for whatever he was going to prepare. So on this particular day, I was at home after working out at the gym. I was getting ready, about to get into the shower, and I got a phone call. And I answered. Well, it was my husband. And I answered and said hello, but he didn't say anything. And I said hello a couple of more times, and he didn't say anything. And so that's when I realized, oh, he's done a butt call. We called it a butt call.
Yeah.
He didn't realize he had called me. And so I was like, oh, okay. And I waited, because I heard him talking, and then I heard a woman talking, and I heard things in the background that let me know that it was in a public place. And so I waited thinking, okay, he's going to say hello, because sometimes he would call me and he would be in conversation with someone and he would say, hold on, Nita. And then I would wait, but he never said that. So I was just waiting for him to come to the phone and say, hold on, Nita. And I heard this woman. And so he never said anything. And I couldn't really make out what she was saying because it sounded like she was speaking from a distance. And then all of a sudden I heard her say, I want to be with you so bad. And that's when my heart just, it exploded. And that's how I found out, through accidental call on his part. At some point, he realized I was on the phone, and then he hung up. Oh, yeah. And I go really deep into the details of that in my book because I actually talk about it.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
So I'm in this closet and all of these questions are coming, and then I want to know where they are, but I don't. So because I wanted to go and show up wherever they were. I wanted to show up on the scene and I wanted to cause some damage. Horror. I'm just being very, very honest, you know?
I get it. Yeah.
But I didn't know. So I stayed in the closet, and then my husband rushed home because, like I said, he finally realized I was on the phone. So he rushed home. And when he came into the house, I could hear his footsteps. And I don't know if you've ever been watching a movie and it was about to hit the high point and you could just feel something about to happen. That's what it was like.
Yeah.
I could feel his footsteps. Horror, it was like they were piercing my soul. The closer he got to the closet, I could hear them, and the faster and louder they became as he got to that closet. And then there he was standing in front of the closet door, and our eyes met. And that moment began the long, hard fight to save my marriage. I did decide to stay.
How long had you been married then?
We had been married for 19 years.
Okay. And just to give me an idea, how long were you married when he passed away?
We were 4 months short of 23 years.
You forgave him?
It took a while.
What made you forgive him?
It was his fight. Because my belief before that happened to me was that once a cheater, always a cheater. And my husband knew how I felt about infidelity. And he knew that if he ever cheated, that I was gone. So my immediate response was divorce. And I actually told him I wanted a divorce. So it wasn't immediate forgiveness and I'm going to stay in this marriage. No, at first I was like, I'm out of here. It's over. The marriage is done. And I also remember how I used to think about other women who stayed in marriages after their husbands had cheated on them. And I still feel bad about saying this, but it's my truth. But I used to think they were stupid.
Every time I've ever judged anybody, God's made it sure that I've experienced it so I could feel stupid about my judgment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So yeah. I get that. I totally get that.
Yeah. So he taught me how to have compassion for other women who go through that type of devastation. And I have a total different outlook on that now. So my husband, after I asked for a divorce, of course, he was devastated. And eventually we started communicating with each other again. And I saw how hard he was fighting to make it right. I saw how remorseful he was, and seeing him fight made me want to fight. And I had never seen my husband fight for anything like that. So he was really remorseful about what he had done. And so that caused me to want to fight for the marriage. And together we fought for it. I mean, we did the heart work. It was very difficult. It was so hard. There were some ugly moments during that process. There was crying. There was a lot that we had to work out and talk through. One of the things that we had trouble with in our marriage was communication, because we handled disagreements differently. If there was a problem or if we were upset with each other about something, I wanted to talk it out. And my husband, he wanted to just be quiet. So he would go quiet on me. And his reason for doing that is to prevent a big blow up. He didn't like arguing. So we never had big arguments in our marriage. We would have our disagreements, but he was trying to keep the peace. And while he was trying to keep the peace by being silent, it was causing resentment in me because I needed to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we were different in that way. Going through the work of healing our marriage, we both learned how to talk with each other. And he started talking and opening up to me a lot. And it felt really good. So I saw those changes in him. And that's what helped me to want to fight for it. And so we did the hard work and we recovered. We recovered from the betrayal. We fell more in love with each other than we had before at any other part of our marriage.
That's awesome. How did he die and how old was he?
So after the betrayal, we recovered and we were continuously working to heal our marriage because it's not like a one and done or an overnight type of healing. It's a continual healing process that you go through. So my husband, after that, he retired from his job. He had served his 30 years and he retired. We were living our best lives, Hara. We were so happy again. We were traveling. We were doing all of the things that we had planned for retirement. But 6 months after he retired, he was diagnosed with brain cancer. Mm-hmm. And then 8 months later, I stood by and watched him take his last breath. That was just absolutely the worst experience of my life. I was his caregiver in our home and I was holding out hope. I had confidence that God was going to heal my husband. That was my prayer, that God would perform a miracle and heal him. And I believed it, Hara. And it wasn't a delusional type of belief. I believed it with all of my heart. But God had different plans and he allowed my husband to die. So I had to go through the grief process over that. And I didn't know how I was going to recover from it. It was so painful and so heartbreaking. I just didn't know how I was going to recover. Of course, people go through it all the time and you do see people recover. But for me, when I was in it, I just couldn't imagine how I was going to be okay again.
Yeah.
And then I started hearing these words. And they were the same words I heard when I was going through the healing process after the betrayal. They were the same words I heard when I was caring for my husband in our home. And the words were stand, trust, endure, and proceed. The first letter of each word spells out the word step. And that's how I came up with the title for my book, Step Into It. So when I heard stand, I thought it meant that I needed to be strong. And I thought, well, I'm a strong woman. I've got this. I can do that. But that's not what it meant. It meant that I needed to stand in my faith, remembering everything that God had already planted into my heart to help usher me through the grief process into my healing. So I did. I stood in my faith and I just allowed God to nourish my heart through the process. And then when I heard trust, again, I thought, oh, I know I got this. I've been trusting God all along. I've been believing, I've been trusting him. But it was different this time. This time it meant that I needed to remember that God is sovereign and he does not allow anything into my life without his permission. And if he gives it permission, then it has purpose because he's an intentional God. Then I heard endure with grace. And I didn't know what that meant because it's one thing to endure, but to endure with grace, how does that look? Well, what it meant was that I needed to allow God to walk me through the process, not trying to fight it, not trying to hide, not trying to run away from the pain, but I needed to allow myself to be deep in that journey as he walked me along the path into my healing. And, Hara, a lot of times people don't want to go through that grief because it's so painful, because it's so difficult. A lot of people want to ignore it. People want to mask it. People will allow themselves to get extremely busy so that they don't have to think about it. And what I have learned through hearing from other people or seeing other people go through, devastation, and it's not just devastation through death, but anything like divorce. I hear about your story of child molestation. It's difficult to go through the healing process from those things. But when we don't allow ourselves to go through the healing process, what happens is we end up taking all of that unresolved grief, hurt, and pain into our future with us. In an attempt to continue moving forward without dealing with it, what happens is we make these trauma decisions. And the trauma decisions are the ones that we're making in an effort to hide or mask or run away from the thing that we've experienced because it's too painful to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And in keeping busy, we think that we're okay, but the trauma, it will show up. Grief will show up and grief will deal with you. You can run if you want, but eventually it will find you and it will deal with you. If you don't deal with grief, grief will deal with you.
I had a counselor once say that if you don't face the thing, it's always on your shoulder. Like you can keep looking ahead and pretending it's not there, but it's always there until you deal with it. It ruled my life for the first 45 years, I'd say, until I did some work, until I could, deal with it and even talk about it.
I get that on a very deep level because when I was writing the book in 2020, I was 54. I had been hiding or protecting my secrets from childhood, from the betrayal, all of those years.
I didn't talk about my childhood sexual abuse till I was 52 and I'm 55. So it's not been long.
Yeah.
Not wanting to face it was the problem.
Because it's too painful.
Too painful and it's scary until it gets out of you.
Mm-hmm.
It's giant inside of you. Don't you think so?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
It's so big. It takes up all the space. How could it possibly escape? But once it does, you're light.
Yes. So after I wrote the book, when I pressed the send button to submit it to the editor, Hara, I literally went screaming through my house. I was here by myself and I went screaming through my house because I thought to myself, oh my gosh, my secrets are out. People are going to know what happened. They're going to know my story. But at the same time, I exhaled. Mm-hmm. It was an exhale of relief and relief because, like you said, I got it off of me. Mm-hmm. I got it off of me and I felt like a huge burden, huge chains just fall from me. One of the things that I had concerned myself with was that what if somebody finds out one day about the betrayal? What if somebody finds out that my husband had an affair? What are they going to think of him? What are they going to think of me? That was heavy on me. And it wasn't something I thought about all the time, but every once in a while I would think about it because people would make comments like, oh, your marriage was so beautiful and these kinds of comments, but they didn't know what had happened in our marriage. So I would have those thoughts like, what if somebody finds out? And so that was heavy on me. Mm-hmm. And then there's the childhood issues that I had. And, I share all of that in my book, but all of those things, they were my secrets. And the trauma that I experienced in childhood, it followed me. And I didn't even realize it, Hara. I didn't realize that I was making trauma decisions based on how I felt about myself and the mindset that I had created for myself and the limiting beliefs that I took upon myself because of the lifestyle that I lived with my family. I didn't even realize it until I wrote that book. I knew that there was like insecurity inside of me, even though people wouldn't know it because of the way I lived. There was always this lingering insecurity inside of me. And I knew I had that, but I didn't really realize fully until I wrote that book where it came from. I cried so much writing that book. I allowed myself to go through that grief process and that healing process. So I endured it with grace by just allowing myself to go through it. And then the final word was proceed. And what that meant was that I needed to continue along the journey that God had ordained specifically for me, using all of the lessons that I had learned from previous trials to help usher me into the purpose for which I've been created in this season. And so that's what I'm doing. I am allowing myself to move forward, continuing to heal from all of the past, from my childhood, my marriage, everything, the death of my husband, and allowing myself to go through it and to grow through it. And not only that, it's not just for me, it's for others, because I see how God is using the courage that he gave me to stand up and open my mouth and to share. I see how it's helping other women because I hear from them. And that is the ultimate beauty of it all, that some of the most devastating experiences that I've had in my life because I decided to obey God and open up and talk about it, that other women are feeling like, okay, if she did it, if she's gotten through this, I can do it too. And for me, it's not just about overcoming those things. It's about overcoming and thriving again in life, because people overcome these things every day, but not every person overcomes and comes out on the other end as a different person or a better person. Like, I will never be the same again, Hara, ever.
Right.
And as I continue to grow and learn more about God and about myself, it equips me to empower other women along the journey.
I love that. I interviewed somebody who had a lot of mental illnesses, and I was talking about the goal of the podcast is that we can overcome what we've suffered through. And he helped me understand that, to stop using the word overcome, because it's too unattainable. Especially as a young kid, he had these diagnoses, and he said it would have never even tried because he couldn't overcome any of it. He had to learn how to deal with it. And so instead, like you're saying, rise above it, not live in the suffering.
I love that.
Somebody just said this too, that we dance with our grief, that it's partnering with it, that it never leaves us. And as a woman who has lost her mother when she was 18, I really loved that, because I don't want to let her go. I want to dance with the grief of losing my mom at a young age. I'm just learning how to reword it so that it is doable for everybody, no matter what we've gone through.
I really like that. I like that.
Our emotions have a right to life.
Sewing became a big part of my healing process. Give me Jesus and a sewing machine. And I actually have it posted on the wall in my sewing room. I had t-shirts made. I had mugs and sweatshirts, everything. I was in my sewing room one day, and this was after, of course, my husband had passed away, and I had not gone into the sewing room for a very long time because he was a big part of my sewing journey. We actually launched my brand, Anita by Design, together after we recovered from the betrayal. When we were going through the healing process, of course, I cried out to God for help because I knew I couldn't do that alone. But I also started sewing a lot because I needed something tangible to focus on. When I sew, it just takes me to another place, and I get to use my creative mind, and it feels good. So I would go into my sewing room every day and I would sew and sew. And then I started posting what I was making into these Facebook sewing groups, and the ladies started coming in and telling me I should start a blog, a YouTube channel. So eventually my husband and I together, we launched Anita by Design, and that closet where I found out about the betrayal, that closet that represented darkness, despair, and pain, has now become a closet of light, hope, and resilience as I teach women all over the world how to sew their own garments. And not only am I putting my gifts back into that closet, but other women that I'm teaching are also putting gifts into the closet. Full circle.
So you were worried about sharing your secrets, and you've discovered that people are reaching out to you more, appreciating you sharing, and also commiserating, and also probably have the same story or similar stories. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
How many children do you have?
I have 2 sons.
How did they handle it, your secrets?
I knew I was going to write the book. And I knew once I surrendered and said yes to God about sharing the other parts of my life, I decided to tell my sons that I was going to be sharing about the betrayal, because they knew about the betrayal. I told them that I was going to be sharing that in the book. And I spoke with them individually on separate occasions. And I didn't really know how they would feel about that. They were both fine. They both said, "Mom, that's your story." And the same thing with my mother and my sisters. And I wasn't going to these people to ask for permission, but I wanted to let them know because I was sharing my story, but they were part of the story.
Right.
And so they said the same thing. It's your story. A lot of times people will not move forward and do the things that they feel on their heart, like writing a book and telling their story, because of the fear of offending the supporting characters, the people who are part of those stories. And I get that. I get it very deeply. One of the things I was afraid of with writing the book and putting those stories in was that people were going to be mad at me.
Yeah.
I didn't want people to be mad at me. My husband's family, I thought, oh gosh, they're going to be mad at me. His coworkers, I thought they're going to be mad at me because everybody loved him.
Yeah.
They loved him. And I had to move forward anyway, because I knew that I was called to do it. And I'm so glad I did, because I got my freedom from putting it out there.
When I first shared my story at 52, I felt so light, and I wanted just to keep sharing it so everybody else could share their story. That was the purpose. The whole point was that I was free now. And I posted about it on Facebook. And the person that touched me inappropriately was my sister's boyfriend. And I just said that thinking nothing about it, because I don't blame her. I don't even blame him anymore. It's not even a blame thing. It's just it was part of the story. And she was so upset and unfriended me on Facebook. Totally get what you're saying, because people have their experience with it and their shame about it.
Yeah.
I did end up apologizing to her, not for saying what I said, but for hurting her unexpectedly. I can see that people do have their own experiences and that there is the possibility of offending others, but I'm glad that you took what you needed, even though.
Yeah. I've been in a couple of business programs with this woman. And one of the things she taught us in telling our stories was that you can tell your story, no matter how dark and devastating it is, and leave the person who offended you with their dignity.
Yeah.
And sometimes that will mean you don't say their names or who it was.
Did you do any counseling or get coached or have any kind of help besides reaching out to God?
Yes, I did. And it was interesting because in the beginning of my healing process after my husband passed away, I thought I was dealing with it just fine. You know, I was allowing myself to go through the cleansings and just dealing with it. And I thought I was just fine. And so people would ask me, have you considered a support group or counseling? And I thought to myself, well, I don't need counseling. Grief is grief. You just deal with it. That was my thinking. Like, it's not an illness. It's just something you have to go through. So I just kind of brushed it off. And then one day, a woman from church invited me to lunch, and she gave me a book by a group called Grief Share. And it's like a 30-day devotional about dealing and going through the grief process. And so I started reading that book, and it was very helpful, and I really enjoyed it. And then one or two people after she gave me that book asked me if I had considered getting some type of support. And then it clicked. Like, maybe this is God whispering in my ear that, you can go and get some support. So this Grief Share group, they have groups that meet around the country. And so I went online and found a support group here in my town. And I was a little hesitant to do that in the beginning because I had attended a grief group with my mother-in-law after my father-in-law passed away. I didn't like it. It seemed dark and people were crying, and I just didn't like it. And I didn't want that experience for myself because I felt like I was dealing with it in a different way. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, I had my crying, but I didn't want to go and be in a room with a bunch of people crying because that was my experience with it. So after I read the book and then someone asked if I would consider it, I did reach out. And so I went to this group and I invited both my sons to go with me. One accepted the invitation and the other didn't. He wasn't interested. So we both went, and the experience was totally different from what I had with my mother-in-law. There was a group of people. We were guided by two leaders, and we watched a video, and then we would have conversation around the table. And yes, there was a little crying, but the meetings weren't overwhelmed by the crying. It's natural to have tears. But the best part of that for me was to hear from other people who were grieving and hearing what they were going through, some of the same things that I was going through, and having a sigh of relief, like, oh, it's not just me. I'm not crazy. Mm-hmm. And so that made me feel really good. So I needed to be in community with other people who truly understood what I was going through, because I shared publicly through Facebook everything while I was going through the whole process, even when my husband was ill. And the reason I shared was because I wanted as many people praying with us as possible. So as I was sharing the process, and then after his death, I continued to share what I was going through, they could sympathize with me, But to be in a community with people who actually understood because they were going through it too was different. It was on a different level. So I really did appreciate it. And I'm really glad I went through that process. It was very helpful for me. So yes, I did get some help. My purpose overall as a woman of God is to glorify him. And I glorify him by walking in obedience to the call that he's placed on my life in this season. And I do that by using the gifts and talents that he's blessed me with so that I can bless other people. So right now, my call is to equip and empower other women to thrive again in life after devastation. The trials of life do not come to destroy you, but they have the potential to usher you into the purpose for which you were created in any season of life. That's what I'm living. I am here to empower and equip other women. I want to see them thrive and happy regardless of what they've been through.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Beneath Your Beautiful, hosted by Hara Allison. And thank you for your ratings and reviews. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Stay tuned.